Suddenly, all the lights went out at once, and the street plunged into pitch darkness. In the heart of a metropolis, the cold light of the moon slightly outlined the contours of the trees, making them ugly and unnaturally crooked. In the darkness of the night, they looked like shaggy monsters whose ugly hands were reaching for my neck. Yeah, my imagination ran wild, showing me the scariest scenes from horror movies starring me. I heard rustling everywhere. Waves of fear were coming one after another, affecting my breathing and heart rate. I was trembling. Where's Jenny? I thought angrily and mentally cursed at my friend. I'd been waiting for her at the crossroads for an hour, but Jenny not only didn't show up on time, she also ignored my phone calls. And I'd called 20 times already. Did she stand me up? Suddenly, I heard a branch crack behind me. Everything inside me went cold. I turned around but couldn't determine the source of the scary sound. At that moment, strong arms wrapped around my body with an iron grip. My chest got squeezed so hard that I couldn't take another breath, and I had no strength to resist. "Don't make a sound." I heard a nasty voice by my ear. A smelly rag fell on my face. From its pungent, nauseating smell, my legs went rubbery and I couldn't control them. Probably I'm now a victim of some psychopath, and they're going to kill me. At this thought, my fading consciousness painted a terrible picture of my mom and dad crying over my dismembered body. I felt that the maniac threw me over his shoulder, like a will-less doll, and my consciousness turned off completely. When I opened my eyes, I immediately closed them from the bright daylight. My whole body ached. I felt pain, so I wanted to return to unconsciousness, but a beautiful male baritone didn't let me sink into slumber. "You finally woke up, beautiful. Don't you remember me at all?" I heard a pleasant voice. Unwillingly, I opened my eyes and saw a radiant face of a handsome guy in front of me. No, I didn't remember him at all. He smiled so sincerely that I involuntarily smiled back. His name was Jack. Turns out I owe this guy my life. That evening, he watched me from the window of his apartment while I was waiting for Jenny and witnessed the brutal attack. "I saw such a beautiful girl standing and waiting for someone, and I admired you," Jack said embarrassedly. "Suddenly, some bastard crept up behind you and covered your mouth with his hand. I flew out of my house like a bullet, and he was already dragging you into a nearby dark alley." Beads of cold sweat broke out on my forehead from Jack's story. God, what a blessing it was that my savior had made it in time. The attacker didn't expect anyone to come to my aid. Jack kicked his butt so hard that the maniac released his failed victim and took off. Although he was bigger, my new acquaintance stayed side by side, calling an ambulance and the cops. Going through these thoughts, I trembled and began to cry. Jack gently took my hand, looking piercingly into my eyes, and whispered, "My baby, don't be afraid. I'll always be there and I'll never let anyone hurt you." It was weird hearing such big words from a barely known, although very cute guy. But there was so much warmth and sincerity in his promise that I calmed down and peacefully fell asleep. During the whole week that I spent in the hospital, my savior was coming to see me every day, more often than my parents did. Doctors even began to greet him, knowing whom he was visiting. He would bring me sweets and fruit every time, and he stayed with me until late in the evening, until a grumpy nurse would kick him out, muttering under her breath that visiting hours had ended long ago. On the day of my discharge, Jack showed up with a huge bouquet of flowers. He looked fantastic. It was only then that I noticed how stylishly he was dressed. As we walked down to the hospital corridor, other patients leaned out of the rooms and stared at us, and the doctors winked cheerily and wished me not to come back. Outside, Jack led me to a cool sports car parked casually near the hospital and gallantly opened the door. "Wow," I involuntarily said when I got into the car and saw the expensive upholstery. The car matched Jack's leather boots and looked perfect with his dazzling white-toothed smile. Meanwhile, my savior got behind the wheel, fastening his seatbelt with a deft movement, and said, "Baby, I hope you don't have to be anywhere. I have a surprise for you." His smooth voice made me feel a sweet wave of love and delight, and at that moment I felt that something very important was going to happen that day. Something that I will remember for the rest of my life. He took me to the most luxurious restaurant in our city. The courteous maitre d' escorted us to an open terrace, which was located on the roof of a high-rise building. There was live music. A saxophonist in a snow-white suit played melodies from romance movies, creating a romantic atmosphere. Jack was unparalleled, as always. He rented the entire terrace, and we were there alone. My savior seated me on a leather sofa and sat down next to me. The bird's eye view of the city took my breath away. I've lived here for 17 years and had no idea how beautiful it was. In the meantime, Jack made a generous order and asked me to dance. His sensitive hands wrapped around my waist so gently that my skin got covered in pleasant goosebumps. He was so close to me for the first time, and my heart almost jumped out, and I lost my breath. And suddenly, his hot kiss made me tremble. It was so unexpected, but now I was trembling not from fear, but from the bliss that spread throughout my body. My consciousness seemed to turn off, and I stopped realizing what was happening. We remembered that evening not only for the sweet kisses, strong hugs, and feeling of happiness. Jack and I had a serious conversation. From the very first moment I saw you, I dreamed of you becoming my girlfriend. Jack began his confession. And if you refuse, it will be difficult for me to come to terms with it. Even if I have an opponent, I'll fight till the end. On the last words, his voice treacherously trembled. I agree, I whispered happily, and fireworks of joy exploded in my soul. The next week passed by in a blur. Jack and I didn't leave each other for a second and were intoxicated by our happiness. But one morning a disturbing thought came to me. Jenny. After that ill-fated day, my friend never reached out, and I completely forgot about her. I frantically dialed Jenny's number, but on the other end of the wire they told me that the subscriber was unavailable. I called my friend's mother, and in response I heard sobs. Turns out that my friend never came home that day. A terrifying thought crept into my head. What if the maniac Jack had saved me from had already attacked Jenny? Beads of sweat appeared on my forehead. My hands reached for the computer, and I typed into the search line, "Girls disappeared in San Antonio." And the search results stunned me. From a selection of the latest news, I learned that in the past few weeks, 7 girls my age had disappeared in the area. The bodies of 5 of them were found in a garbage dump outside the city. In all this time, I'd been enjoying my romance with Jack and not even remembering my best friend, my dear Jenny. At the thought that the most terrible thing could have happened to her, a chilling horror squeezed my chest. That moment, the image of a tall, bow-backed man selling hot dogs in a bistro near the school came to my mind out of nowhere. Jenny and I once went there. He looked at us so predatorily, as if he was undressing us with his eyes. And another girl from a parallel class started a rumor that he once offered her a free Coca-Cola if she allowed him to hug her and kiss her on the lips. But when I heard this story, I decided that was kind of crazy. Could a person with such bad inclinations be allowed to work in an establishment so near a school? However, now this man seemed very suspicious to me, and things I didn't attach importance to before felt real now. I decided to follow this suspicious guy and waited for the end of his workday. The bistro closed at 10 p.m., and at that time it was already dark. Probably on that day, my fatal mistake was not warning Jack about where I was going. It seemed to me that I would look like an idiot if I told him about my suspicions, and then they wouldn't be confirmed. What a fool! But first things first. The alleged maniac locked the doors, turned on the alarm, and went into the darkest alley. A wave of fear rolled up in my throat, but I bravely followed him. We wound through the deserted streets for so long that at the end I no longer understood what part of the city we were in, when suddenly I realized that we were in some kind of abandoned wasteland. Despite the darkness of the night, I managed to make out the outlines of an abandoned 2-story building that looked like a warehouse. The door was buried under some pieces of metal and stone. The man walked along the wall, got on all fours, and climbed into a barely noticeable hole, which could only be seen up close. It's amazing how such a broad-shouldered guy could fit in it. Catching my breath and waiting a minute, I darted after him. It was totally dark inside that building, and suddenly a lantern flashed brightly right in front of my face, the reflections of which I saw in the evil eyes in front of me. It was the guy I was chasing. Then I felt a hit to my head and everything disappeared. I came to my senses, feeling a sharp pain in my wrist, and I realized that my hands were chained to a battery. From the dim light coming through the nailed-up windows, I understood that it was already daytime. There was noise in my ears and I felt very dizzy, apparently the consequences of the hit. I carefully examined the room, and it looked like a workshop, and I was stunned. Not far from me lay a half-naked girl. She was unconscious and moaning loudly. Her body was completely covered in bruises, and a trickle of blood flowed down her face. Oh God, it was Jenny! At that moment, the bow-backed man entered the room, holding a huge pair of scissors in his hands. He grinned wickedly, looking at me, and approached my friend. I screamed loudly, but the maniac didn't pay attention to my heart-rending cries. He just let out a satisfied chuckle and began to cut off Jenny's long, tangled hair. In those terrible moments, I said goodbye to my life. My poor Jack, I thought sadly, tired of screaming and closing my eyes not to see all this horror. We spent so little time together and didn't get to do so much. Why did I meet you at the end of my life? And then I heard a strangled wheeze and a dull sound. As a large, heavy body had fallen to the ground, I opened my eyes and saw the maniac thrown to the ground with his arms twisted back, and sitting on top of him was Jack, holding the killer in a stranglehold. How he found us that day still remains a mystery to me. The next second, the cops burst into the abandoned workshop and handcuffed the criminal. Jack ran up to me and freed my hands from the hurtful bonds. My boyfriend hugged me tightly and started covering my face with kisses. From his touch, I dissolved in blissful calmness and didn't even see how people in white coats carried my friend away on a stretcher. Jenny got better soon. The psychopath who was kidnapping girls didn't do irreparable harm to her. But in order to fully recover mentally, my friend had to go through rehabilitation therapy for several years. After Jack saved me a second time, he no longer lets me take a single step away from him. He thinks that if he leaves me alone, I'll definitely get into some sort of trouble. He might be right, but sometimes I feel like he uses this to hide his jealousy and unwillingness to share me with anyone. He even asked me to marry him right after graduation, but I haven't yet given him an answer. Let him suffer a little. Although I'll confess to you that I've been secretly choosing my wedding dress already.